Crowlight, Chapter 2. Quinny. What are you roving round here? Are there enough work in the cities? Vacation, Kian replied ironically. A moment of silence occurred, and the coachman peered back over his shoulder and he threw him a self-derisive smile. Visiting my relatives, he stated, a little more assertive, an evasive claim that came easy to him, because it wasn't a real lie. It was common business that people mistrusted him, for he was not much of a talker on his run-down side. Quinny Farm. They gave his destination shortly as the cart moved on. Ah, the clan without the Mac, the driver chuckled. Relatives, are they? Another look back, and this time was more closely. You don't look very eager to see them. They're just distant kinsmen. Without any sign of unsettledness, Kian returned the gaze and looked on too. The coachman raised his eyebrows and then turned towards the road, rambling and jolting on a few minutes past. So where you from? Cities. The man in the seat gave a raucous laugh. Alright, you don't want to talk. I like your humour, son. And I rate your courage, old man. Kian teased back, and this time they shared a broad, forthright smile, and the carter looked back. Just call me Nate, he offered. A cheery click of his tongue let the horse proceed in a slow trot. And this old lady's called Jeddah. Like the racehorse? It struck him right away, his voice slightly amused. Aye, except for it's a she, Nate burst out rident, while his passenger leaned back against one of the bulged potato sacks. Gods, this is centuries ago. But you know about? You're acquainted with horses? I'm a blacksmith. And a Londoner. I used to be. The young man grinned. He picked up on how the older one avoided the term cockney. A matter of politeness for sure. The same that made him leave his own taciturn mood aside. It wasn't very prevalent anymore, giving strangers a ride. So he knew exactly what he had to show himself grateful for. My ancestors were Irish, but name only. Kian, by the way. Ages ago too, I know from hearsay. Oh, so that's why you said distant kin. Nate cracked a low pun, and Kian derisively snorted up at the grey sky above him. Nah, seriously, I haven't seen him in years. They probably can't even remember. Unseen by his favourer, he closed his eyes and swallowed. His teeth clenched, silently holding back the racking feeling in his guts. This wasn't the pangs of hunger, although his last meal had been yesterday around noon. Despite the lie, there was a truth behind his words that he couldn't deny. Cúin hadn't seen him in years, 3.5 years added up again, only a toddler of 2 years himself when he left him first, soon followed by his big brothers who nicknamed him Quinny. His little sunshine with the flaxen Kane-locks, just as frizzy as his brothers, they took just after him. Liam and Kian were both raven-haired, but all three of them had his own dark brown eyes, grizzly eyes like May used to say, and he remembered how reproachful they both looked at him throughout the ignominious bargain. I know this is quite unusual and immoral, but will you can't just leave and please listen to me? Not quite inadvertently, in black despair, his strong palm banged against the edge of the table. Dead silence came down on him, and now he could feel the keen looks from every nook in the room. He waited till the talks of the other tables continued. Then he looked forward and lowered his voice. I have to. To do what, Kian? Sell your tenure and start over? You can lease it anew, he explained dryly. And you and your wife has no kids, do you? His senior looked at him, attentive but cautiously, and struggling for further words that could convince him. Kian licked his lips. Listen, we're starving. The whole fucking town is starving. The whole province is starving. You'll spare the money you technically owe me and earn from the lease. All I ask of you is that you take my son and help out the lessees with the gainings if you can. Conaghay eyed him up without any reply, but he nodded slightly, apparently deep in thoughts about his offer. Your older ones? A barely visible jerk with his head at his two curly heads. Liam's brown eyes wandered back and forth between them, while Kian was nibbling off his fingernails. None of them dared a word. They're old enough to work, Kieran said. But Quinny, he hesitated, looking down on his youngest, who crawled about beneath the chair on the wooden floor, sometimes just sitting there playing, baby talking to himself and to his animal figurine. He had no idea what was going on above his blonde curly head, and when he glanced up on them, it's because they fell quiet. The young blacksmith averted his face. I can't take care of them where I go, and if I stay... There was a brief gesture, catching his eye, an informal wave of Conaghay's hand. Not a refusal, just an obliging sign of understanding. You can't support all three of them. He nodded, lips compressed, but with a steady eye contact with his landlord. There was no reason to play down the issue. It was an open secret that he could barely attract new business or fulfill them since his wife died. Being a single father, 3 children, was a full-time job. And even if he could send off his older boys as day tailors, Quinny was just too young to do any work. He could barely talk. They were both routine and conscientious with housework and fieldwork. But as 5 and 6-year-olds, they were not capable of hard work with fire and iron. I'm planning on more than increasing my own work. I want to improve my skills, my profession. Work my way up to be an ornamental smith, a goldsmith, or even an armourer someday. If I specialise as far as I can, I'll find work everywhere. Just give me a few years, 4 or 5 at least. One of my boys can be my apprentice, or do some other job. You're aiming high. Conaghay shook his head, a smile of disbelief on his lips, but it was not unfriendly. As usual, I have to admit, he went ahead, and his smile grew more radiant from ear to ear. Your father would be proud of you, boy. Would he? Kieran asked back, almost deadpan. This and the graveness in his voice left the smile frozen on the landowner's lips. Even his duties had been affected by the famine. He wasn't really the one evicting his own tenants, but Kieran knew he was subordinated to those so-called overlords in common parlance. So, even as a blacksmith who had barely enough familiarity with farming that he could bare hand on the fields, the young man was aware that this would only be a matter of time. What about your tools? The anvil? The furniture? Doesn't hold me back. Sell it. Hand it on. Your property. We can't eat on rot goods, can we? He joked warily, then turned and insisted again. Except for the field forge. Make sure there's a fire for the orphaned when I'm gone. This time, they exchanged a long, meaningful look. Once, Kieran Kane had been one of the many slum kids too. Only aged 8 when his mother died, and 3 years before Harold Conaghay brought up part of the derelict area. Hired his dad and his goddamn mobile forge, scrap iron by itself, and started to clear the slums. Most of the buildings there had been restored because of the drift to the cities and the amount of airship travellers besides the dirigible teams. All of the suburbs reliving good old smoke from the stage of siege by the intern workers. Made good money along the way, no matter if the buggy of recession spooked around the city or not. The slumification was overall. Kieran had just been one of the lucky ones. Coincidentally, living on the outskirts, a man of affairs saw a certain potential in him. Under the patronage of Conaghay, little by little the outer borough flourished into a considerable settlement. An amiable, rough-and-ready neighbourhood committed to each other. Within its range, Kieran, Little Big Grace, earned his spurs as a casual hand, or a loon, as Conaghay put it. Later on, after his father managed to booze and work himself to death, Kieran took over the forge, as well as his stubborn will to work. He was 14 when he took the road for the first time, 17 when he came back. And even if he was an absentee landlord already, it reached Harold Cunha's ears how provident he lived, for he had wedding plans with the girl that had waited for him. At age 19, the ambitious young man had a quite occupational status in his suburban town, and also amongst men of his craft. Shortly after his engagement, he rented one of the renovated buildings. A year later, May, the bakery salesgirl, and Kieran, the blacksmith, had their first son. Liam, who sat on his chair and still watched them, but now with a comprehending expression on his face. Not as round-eyed as Kian stared, but the knowledge they shared in their uneasy silence was way more gut-wrenching than if they broke out into tears. "Will you take him?" A few seconds, Conaghay nailed him down with a piercing glance, just as his kids. "I'll talk to my wife." He finally breathed out and threw him a goodwill nod. "If she agrees, you can bring him tomorrow." Thank you," Kieran whispered, throaty. And now everything was said. Both men grabbed for their tankard and gulped the dull dishwater. The worn-out food industry passed off his beer. Right after his supplicant footed the bill, Conaghay left the tavern. "Oh!" Nate's baritone voice brought him back to reality. Dank, flimsy snowflakes hit his face and trickled down his skin. He wiped the dripping wet off and sat up. "You all right, son?" Yes, I am." He rose his voice in a firm, almost stoic calm. The carriage hadn't stopped already when he came to his feet. "Here we are, Conaghay Farm." From the corner of his eye, Kieran noticed a resurveying look. Swiftly he jumped off the load bed. "Hey, boy!" "If you need any appointment, there's a new tavern here, halfway to Suffolk." "A new one?" Irritated, he looked about the kitchen. "New owners." "Wait, what happened to Biddy and Max?" "They moved on like so many," Nate shrugged off. "Met them briefly hauling some of their stuff over the Bay of Dare." The blacksmith gave another growl of despise. Though it came all around the country, he always steered clear of the capital. "Fucking long way. My freight charges are still more fair than the Castellers." Nate slagged off the dirigibles. "Never been there," Kieran said point blank. And again he turned his gaze at the estate. A grange of several buildings, contrasting the steel grey shimmering sky. Now that he was so close to his son, his thoughts were distracted. The Crowlight was reflected silverishly by the lit windows, and just behind them glimmered the golden light of home.